Locks allow boats to travel uphill or downhill. They provide a chance for the whole crew to get involved and are often a place where you'll swap stories and local knowledge with other boaters. Locks do come in different shapes and sizes, but the principle of using them is pretty much the same. A lock is simply a chamber with gates to contain the water at either end. The flow of water in and out of the lock is controlled by sluices called paddles, which are operated using a windlass. The paddles at the top of the lock are used to let water in, and those at the bottom to let water out, thus raising or lowering your boat. Stop the boat well before the lock. Hold the boat with ropes and put one or more crew members ashore to get the lock ready. If there are only two of you, you may have a centre line. This makes it easier for one person to hold the boat steady, but the centre line should never be used for mooring up. The golden rule at locks is to take your time and do things methodically. Remember that some of the lock mechanisms can be stiff and heavy to operate. Consider getting your fittest or strongest crew members to do the hard work. Make sure you lift any side fenders before going into a lock. It's important that the steerer stays at the tiller at all times with the engine running, so the boat is always under control. Children love to get involved and help out at locks. It's all part of the adventure. But locks are deep with strong water flows, so be particularly vigilant and make sure they're always fully supervised. For younger children in particular, the paddle gear is often at head height, so keep them well clear. A spinning or flying windlass can cause a lot of damage. Never leave a windlass unattended on the paddle mechanism. It's important that crew operating paddles stay by their paddle mechanism until the lock is empty or full and they remain in contact with the skipper in case of emergency. Keep an eye on the boat at all times, and if anything goes wrong, close all paddles quickly and sort out the problem. Some locks have anti-vandal devices which you release with a handcuff key. Just a word about priority. Locks aren't operated on a first-come, first-served basis, but on whether the lock can be used by another boat without wasting water. For example, if you're going downhill and come to a lock that's empty, always check to see if another boat is approaching from below the lock. If so, the lock would be in their favour. Wait for them to enter and use the lock. You would have had to fill the lock anyway, so you might as well do it with a boat in it. Of course, if there isn't another boat coming, you don't need to wait for one to arrive. It's a case of using a little courtesy and common sense to save water. If there isn't another boat coming, make sure the gates and paddles at the far end of the lock are closed before lifting the paddles at the end nearest the boat to fill the lock. Make sure the windlass is a snug fit on the spindle by using the correct hole. All paddle mechanisms will have a safety catch of some type. These should always be engaged where possible. When the lock is full, push the gate open, steer the boat into the lock and make sure the top paddles are fully closed. Always wind the paddles back down. Letting them drop can cause them to break and put the lock out of action. Close the top gate. Then you can open the paddles in front to let the water out. The steerer needs to keep an eye on the back of the boat to make sure it's always clear of the top gate sill. If necessary, briefly engage forward gear to keep the boat away. Make sure the front is clear of the bottom gate and that the boat is floating freely. As the lock empties, you'll find that the bottom gates will open quite easily once the water levels are equalised. Trying to force them before they're ready is a total waste of effort. Close all paddles and, unless another boat is approaching, close the gates. Collect your crew, unless there's another lock close by, in which case it's easier for them to stay off the boat and walk ahead to get the next lock ready. Going uphill is a similar procedure. If the lock is full, make sure another boat isn't approaching, then empty it and steer the boat in. On most canals, you won't experience strong currents, but on some, water flows round the locks quite fast. If you see water movement, steer into the flow, as it will push the front of the boat away, then back as it passes. Close the bottom gates and make sure the paddles are fully down. To fill the lock, open the top paddles one at a time. Do this slowly. It's a good idea to initially lift the first paddle just halfway to avoid a great insurge of water that can throw the boat backwards and forwards, making it difficult to control. If the lock is fitted with paddles in the top gate, don't open them until they're underwater. Opening them too early can cause water to swamp the front of the boat. Again, open them slowly and keep a watchful eye on the boat at all times. When the lock is full, the gate will open easily. Check that the paddles are all down and close the gates after the boat, unless another boat is waiting to use the lock. Sometimes you'll come across 2 or more locks joined together in what is known as a staircase, where the top gate of one lock is the bottom gate of the next. Setting these locks is slightly different from a normal lock. Make sure that all paddles are down. If you're going uphill, the bottom lock should be empty with the upper ones all full. You use the water from the upper locks to fill the lower ones in turn, raising you up the flight. When going downhill, the top lock should be full with the lower ones empty. You empty the upper lock into the lower ones in turn. With staircase locks, it's important to check that another boat hasn't started in the opposite direction before you enter the first lock. The general rule is 1 boat up, 1 boat down, unless local notices tell you otherwise. Broad locks, that is ones which are wider than your boat, need a little extra care. Try to share with another boat whenever possible to save water, and always use the front and back ropes to steady the boat in the lock. When you're using the lock alone and going uphill, always slowly open the top ground paddle. That's the one on the lock side rather than the one in the gate, on the same side as the boat first. This way, the flow of water into the lock will help to keep the boat against the lock wall, making it easier to control. When the lock is part full, you can open the paddles on the opposite side as well. Don't use gate paddles until they're underwater.